Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's conversation on procurement benchmarking. This discussion is brought to you by Procurement League and the Hackett Group. Today, we'll be taking questions throughout the conversation, so be sure to comment, send us your thoughts and questions, and we'll discuss as many as we can along the way. I'm your host, Prerna Kaushik, and I'm joined today by Chris Shauchik. Chris is a principal, global practice leader, and advisory leadership team member with the Hackett Group, an intellectual property based strategic consultancy to global companies. Chris has over 20 years of experience successfully advising hundreds of Fortune 500 and mid-sized companies across all industries globally. He has provided operational and transformational guidance in strategy and organizational change, as well as process design and digital technology enablement to significantly improve the efficiency and effectiveness of these companies. Chris is globally recognized and he has won several rewards in his specialty of supply management, including strategic sourcing and risk management. So, today we are going to have an interactive discussion on procurement benchmarking. The conversation does talk about the importance of procurement benchmarking. It goes much more profound as we talk about the digital maturity of procurement, how the digital procurement methodologies have changed over time, and the future ahead. I can assure you that the discussion will leave you with so much to think about. We want to keep this discussion super interactive, so keep posting your questions. We'll take as many as possible. Before that, I would like to know from where you all are checking in. So quickly go to the comment section and let us send a quick hello, drop in from where you all are checking in. I'm checking in from India, and for those who have just joined us, let me give you a heads up. To get your pressing industry questions answered, we have Krish Sochik, Principal Global Practice Leader and Advisory Leadership Team member with the Hackett Group here with us. Chris, I'm so excited to have you today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself, how your day at work looks like, and how you started in procurement.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not an exciting story in terms of, I'll say an architected approach or journey to get into procurement. It was, sort of by happenstance that I sort of fell into the space of supply management and procurement. And, I always like when you say, well, he's got over 20 years of experience in this space. Once you get to a certain level of experience, you just say it's over 20 years. But I actually started off when I came out of school. I was actually came out of school as an electrical engineer, so I was very technical. I got a double E degree, and so I started working for United Technologies, and was working in one of their divisions, doing electronic kind of work, and I was actually working in a electronics facility in a testing lab, developing code that would test microcircuits for a large aerospace platform that this company was building. After that, I actually started working for IBM, and then again I went to IBM. I was an electrical engineer, and at the time I was designing things like the support processor. But it was a time I actually started getting into some code, and we were sort of working on some of the precursors to the artificial intelligence today. Working on knowledge-based systems. So I was working on that, but in parallel to doing that, I was actually working on my master's in business administration. And it was at that time I started gaining much more interest on the business side of things. And, it sort of pivoted me. And, one of the things I did at IBM after being in engineering, I said, you know what, I'd like to go into the business side of things and potentially get into marketing, get into sales with IBM. And so about halfway through my career at IBM, which lasted about 6.5 years, I moved over and got into the sales and marketing side of IBM. And at the same time, as I was mentioning, I was working on my master's. Well, while I was at IBM, and not many people know this, but IBM, really stands for I've been moved. And,
Yeah.
and during that 6-year period with IBM, I lived in 3 different locations. And, prior to me leaving, there was a potential of me going to a 4th location. But it was at that time I decided to leave IBM, and there was an executive from IBM that had, moved on and started working in consulting. And when I was at IBM, we used to have the opportunity of having consultants come in and speak to us. And I always thought that was an interesting role because they had an opportunity to sort of blend, their analytical skills plus, relationship skills. And I saw that, I said, this may be something that I really would enjoy doing. And so, I went into this firm, one that I really didn't know, and really going in there, with an approach that management consulting was management consulting, and I would say that fortunately, what this firm focused on was strategic sourcing and supply base, supply chain, et cetera. So I was introduced to a whole new area. And and in many ways, I said, this is something I'm going to do for a few years, and then I'll go do something else. And here I am today, still focused on the space. And I would like to say the reason I'm still here is because of the excitement in the space. What I saw, over 20 years ago in supply management, at a time when we were trying to convince, chief financial officers and companies that going out and re-architecting your supply base, saving money was a good thing. That seems like eons ago, and that's certainly not what we're dealing with today. And so this area has evolved significantly, and to where we are today, where it's really exciting, and you see the amount of investment coming into really the formation of the digital tools, the ecosystems that are out there. It's really, really exciting, and it's a fantastic place to be. But that's the journey of how I got here. As I always say, it was more by happenstance than it was by design.
That's absolutely interesting journey, Chris. So that's awesome, and I'm humbled that you joined us today. So you have been in procurement for 2 decades now, and you also had a good time creating computers and microprocessors in your early
Mm-hmm.
career as an electrical engineer. So this
Yeah.
makes you a perfect fit for our digital procurement conversation. But before diving deep into the digital procurement space, I want to start this conversation with procurement benchmarking. So
Yeah.
Hackett has one of the best benchmarking methodologies. So what makes the difference? What is there that distinguishes an excellent research methodology according to you?
Yeah. Well, Hackett's been in the benchmarking space for, 30 years. And I would say that, one of the things that really defines what we do is and I would say it's a several different things. It's the rigor by which you go about benchmarking. And one of the things that we utilize is a taxonomy.
Mhm.
And, it's a process taxonomy. And it's not a taxonomy that doesn't change over time. So the taxonomy that we were using, 20 years ago for procurement isn't the same as what we're using today. And it won't be the same of what we may be using, 5 years from now. And so it continues to change. And part of the reason of that is that there are processes that were not that, I'll say, evident or, utilized within organizations even 5 years ago. And so what we have the opportunity to do is we continue to, re-architect this taxonomy of what a procurement organization is. We have been seeing, over, the last, especially 5 years, new activities coming into procurement, things that were maybe, small pieces of what we did become much more elevated and much more prominent in what we do as an organization. And 2021 has been a real eye-opener, I think, for organizations in terms of what the power of supply management is all about. So we've seen the elevation of things like supply risk. Not that risk wasn't a focus in many organizations prior to this, but it's been elevated significantly over the last year as a result of the pandemic. But we've also seen things like the CSR, corporate social responsibility, supplier diversity, sustainability, all sort of common areas elevated significantly as well. So when you look at our methodology and our taxonomy specifically, that taxonomy and what you're going to see more and more of is some of these areas that were more nascent in what we did as an organization will be much more prominent, going forward in the taxonomy itself. I think the other thing is you talked about methodology.
Yeah.
In many ways, when I think about methodology, I think about the process that you actually execute to conduct a benchmark. And yes, we do have a methodology there, and it's a very rigorous methodology. I think it's been applied to, I see the numbers that we utilize, something like 10,000 plus benchmarks. I don't know what the number is, but it's a big, big number. And it's something that we've been utilizing for many, many years. But it's a 5-step methodology for actually conducting and executing a benchmark. Everything from a planning to the data collection to a validation of that data, which is a very, very important step. creating a draft in terms of whatever the results are, and finalizing the conclusions or recommendations, the insights, the gaps that come out of that benchmark itself. So that's the sort of the overall methodology. What you have seen over time is that be enabled with digital tools. So if you went back 20 years ago, much of that exercise of conducting that benchmark was very manual in terms of collecting the information. What you see today is an environment where the benchmarking information and the collection of that data, by the individuals within the companies that go through a benchmark is much more augmented with technology and digital tools. I think the last thing that, I would say about the methodology is that when organizations go through, these benchmarks, it is a blend of different types of measures. It's not just about what I would call output performance of a procurement organization. An output performance, benchmark within procurement, may be something that is, cost savings, a very common measure that supply management and procurement organizations measure. But that's the result of other activities. It's not an activity in and of itself. But there's also practice measures. And one of the things that we go through in benchmarks is to try to understand not only what is the output performance of an organization, but also what may be driving that performance. And this is where you want to look at some of the practices those organizations engage in that allow them to achieve certain levels of performance, whether that performance is not so good or it's really good, because it helps you understand causation as to why certain performance is achieved by certain organizations.
Absolutely, Chris. I cannot agree more on this. And I guess in 2014, VUCA was introduced to the management, and since then, for the world-class procurement performance, I believe that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is what that is making a difference. And for
Yeah,
an excellent methodology, I believe the procurement team should understand that what their VUCA is.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the best procurement organizations in this world, if I talk about, say they focus intently on creating value and in their extended supply chains as well, and they are very good at measuring this value as well. So
Mhm.
benchmarking complements this effort, I believe, and helping procurement groups identify new sources of value. They pinpoint new capabilities and make a case for change as well. But Chris, benchmarking itself is a part of a broader competency in performance management as well, and that keeps procurement aligned with stakeholders and their dynamic needs. So this brings me to my next question, that how can procurement teams benefit from benchmarking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're asking me reasons why procurement organizations, benchmark. There are several reasons, and they're not all the same. I mean, sometimes it's just to do a competitive comparison. You may be in a particular industry and want to compare how well am I performing in my supply management organization versus others. And so you may just want to do, within your industry, this is when we want to look at your industry only and look at how well am I performing versus others. And if am I below, the average or the mean of my overall, competitors and peers within my industry. And that will give you some information as to, are there things I need to change? If you went through that and found out that I'm performing better than all of my peers, then you may decide that there may be other things that I want to go do, but at least informs you as to where you are. So that's one thing. I mean, we don't always subscribe to the competitive benchmarking as much. More of what we focus on is what we call transformational benchmark. And so some organizations will use benchmarking to drive a transformational change within their organization. And what a benchmark can do is to help build a business case. You're always, when you're trying to build a business case, is to, I'm here today and I want to be in, point Y in the future. Organizations, are going to ask, well, why is that? And because there's an investment in people, investment in, monetary investments, et cetera, to make that journey. And so, one of the things that organizations will use a benchmark is to say, let me show you where we are today, how we compare, no different than the competitive benchmarking, but how do we compare versus other organizations, and use that. Let's just say you were trailing the performance of other organizations. This gives a business case to say, we need to improve our capabilities as a result of that. Other organizations will do benchmarking to create what I call a baseline. They may go through, some kind of effort. And so, you know what? I'm going to go invest. And this may be a requirement of a leader in the organization that maybe this head of supply management is reporting to. So I want a baseline. I want to know where we are today. And probably in most cases, they would already have done that because it helps to formulate the business case. But I want a baseline to say, if we're going to do all of this activity, I want to make sure that it's actually improving us, not only in terms of where we were before to where we are next in terms of our own internal measures, but it's actually improving us when compared to others as well, that we're becoming more competitive in our industry, that we're becoming more competitive, across a broader set of procurement organizations and a better performer. So they'll use it to set a baseline, and then in the future, use it to, measure against. And so what this does is to help highlight the impact of the transformational efforts that they actually put in place. Mm-hmm. I think, one of the other things is just to use a benchmark to highlight and help to prioritize what you need to go focus on. I think most organizations, leaders of procurement, as they look at their organization, can sit there and say, you know what, these are the things that I need to go focus on. These are my priorities. And, the benchmarking can serve as a way to validate those. In some cases, what you find out is that some of the areas that, leaders may feel that are areas that they should be focusing on, when they go through the benchmark, find out that the gaps between where they are in those areas and other organizations really isn't that large, or they're really in alignment with other organizations. In other cases, there are areas that they didn't think were opportunities. And what they find out through the benchmark is that, there's a bigger opportunity here, a bigger gap than what we thought. And so it actually drives them potentially to reprioritize what they're actually focusing on. So those are some of the ways that organizations use benchmarking to inform what they're looking to go do on a go-forward basis.
Absolutely, Chris. And we cannot deny that before delving into particular benchmarks, we really need to learn that which benchmark is better to get any value out of them. So procurement teams need just not to buy better, but also measure better, so that they are focused on doing the right things before they focus on just doing them the right way relative to others. So apart from that, Chris, I believe that there is a third dimension to it as well. You buy better, you measure better, and you communicate the results better, so that executives can understand the function's current capabilities, what are the assessed performance relative to business value and strategy, the plan, manage, and accelerate your journey towards world-class performance as well. So, Chris, this brings me to my next question. What would be your pick of the top 5 metrics to talk to the procurement head who will be assessing their function's maturity?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I can't say it's not a question that I've been asked, hundreds of times. What are the measures I ought to be using? And usually my response to this is I have no idea. And I'll tell you the reason why. I have a set of guidelines. I call it my 10 guidelines for creating a set of metrics, a scorecard for a procurement organization. But to be honest with you, it can be used for any organization, whether another function, the enterprise in totality. And my first rule in that set of guidelines is alignment. And the alignment between the supply management organization and the overall enterprise itself. What is that alignment? What is the organization focused on and actually accomplishing? At the end of the day, supply management and any, capability within the organization is there to enable the success of the overall enterprise. In most cases, the business that we're in. And so what are we doing to do that? And the enterprise will have objectives, that they form to meet, whatever they got to go do. And our job in procurement is to enable those objectives. Now, I know this is blasphemy, but if the organization said, we don't care about margins, we don't care about costs, et cetera, then I shouldn't see cost savings on a procurement scorecard, even though it's by far the most common measure that procurement organizations use to measure their overall performance. So the key is alignment. But there are other things like balance as well, that when you look at the measures you ought to use, are they balanced? And in many ways, people use the term balanced scorecard. Well, the reason they use that is that you don't want to be unidimensional, that all these measures in and of themselves, or by themselves, can create, if you only focused on one particular measure, it may, have an impact on other measures if you didn't look at those in totality and in balance with other measures. So a lot of times procurement organizations will consider the financial aspects of its performance, things like cost savings. It'll consider the operational aspects of what it's doing as well, delivery and supplier delivery performance, et cetera. They may look at, their ability and the performance of the supply base, that they're engaging with, also, what stakeholders think of them in terms of the ability for procurement to enable their success. They may look at people measures as well. So there's a set of things. I think the better question sometimes is, what are the most common measures that organizations are using? And when you think about commonality in measures, what you do see is that there are common measures. Cost savings and cost avoidance are very common measures that procurement organizations utilize. So is, the cost of procurement, because, what that ultimately goes to is, what is my return on investment? If I'm investing in this capability, like any other investment you make in an organization, what am I getting in return for that? And how can I maximize that return? So, ROI becomes, a measure that we're starting to see more and more organizations looking at those types of measures. Velocity or speed. So, cycle time becomes an important measure. If you look at the fundamentals of digital transformation, one of the fundamentals is velocity. How can I do what I'm doing in a much faster way? Understanding that the pace of business is much more quicker and much more accelerated than what we have seen in the past. So velocity, becomes a very important measure as well. But the other one is just the experience and the satisfaction of the stakeholders. Are we enabling them in the way they need to be enabled to be successful? And so gaining some insight around measures, and sometimes that's done with surveys of the stakeholders to understand, how are we doing as a function as well. But those are some of the more common measures that I would recommend. But the point is that it's unique to every organization. You got to follow some guidelines. And I feel like if you follow the guidelines, things like alignment, areas like balance, there's a number of different guidelines, you will come out with with the best practice, scorecard and set of measures for your organization. One other point I want to make is that when you look at measures, and you asked about, specific measures, I think you have to look at it, across a broad spectrum. One way to look at measures is to look at, ones that are, well, I'll put them into three different categories. There's a set of measures that would be what I would consider efficiency types of measures. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is that you could look at the cost of your function. What am I investing in to perform this set of activities in supply management? That would be a cost measure, right? Or an efficiency measure. I may look at my staffing levels. Cycle times are an element or a degree of determining how efficient we are as an organization. Another set and dimension is effectiveness. If I'm making all of these investments, what am I getting in return for those investments? So an example of an effectiveness measure would be spend cost savings and spend cost avoidance. And there are other ones as well. Beyond that is the whole area around experience, the third dimension. What kind of experience are we creating for those stakeholders that engage with this capability that we've created? And that capability or the set of stakeholders that we're engaging with are not limited to our internal stakeholders, those that are in the business that we're supporting. But it can also be our external customers, depending on how close that is. And more importantly, it's our suppliers. They're stakeholders in this capability that we've created. And so you see these measures and they evolve over time. There are measures today that are more traditional. Cost savings is one of those measures. There are measures that we would consider to be more modern measures that, that may include things like ROI, measuring working capital and what are we doing to, conserve cash within our business, things like supply risk reduction. How are we bringing some visibility and quantification to what we're doing from a supply risk standpoint? But there's also what we would consider to be emerging measures and performance measures. Some of those emerging They're really starting to focus on things like supplier-enabled innovation. How are we measuring and bringing visibility to the efforts of we as a procurement organization? How are we enabling, the engagement of our supply base and the capabilities there with the internal capabilities of our organization? And one of those can be our product development processes. Are we able to innovate that and accelerate the efforts that we're doing there to allow us to be more competitive in the marketplace?
Absolutely, Chris. I totally agree. And this is very helpful, I would say, because when we are creating balanced scorecards, we cannot just consider the procurement only. We cannot just consider procurement function. We have to look around the enterprise as we are becoming more strategic function, as procurement is becoming more strategic function. So we have to look for the enterprise as well, that, okay, how my other stakeholders are impacted by the KPIs that I'm measuring. And I believe that Hackett takes pride in being one of the first research organizations who have coined the effectiveness and efficiency KPIs for the procurement and finance function. So, Chris, would you please explain to our audience the meaning of these and how they have changed over the years?
The like the maturity are you talking about, or the?
Yes, so I'm talking about, like, we have talked about the measures, like the
Yeah,
KPI. So they have changed. Like, earlier we were
yeah,
not considering a lot of data. Now we are considering a lot of data. So the KPIs have changed over a period of time, over a decade. So we want to understand that how that change have happened.
yeah. Well, I think the change happens, with what's happening in the world itself. And as I mentioned before, when I was, sort of, you asked me to introduce myself, and one of the comments I made is that when I first came into the space, we were trying to convince leaders in organizations, and more specifically, leaders in the finance organization. In many cases, the procurement supply management organizations were reporting up to the CFO that saving money and cost savings, was a good thing. And this was really the environment was, you saw a massive emergence of strategic sourcing, where organizations were going out there, rationalizing their supply bases, and as a result of that, extracting a lot of different value. And so at that time, one of the key measures, was, around, spend cost savings. And it's still a very dominant measure on our scorecards. But what we have seen over a number of years is that that measure still remains. We haven't seen it necessarily take a reduction in its prioritization in procurement organizations. But what we have seen is the augmentation of that with other measures. And so what we're seeing is a broadening of what procurement is doing. And one of the things I highlighted also coming out of the pandemic, and even some of the social unrest of last year, it really has caused sort of a broadening of what I would say are the priorities of supply management executives. One, broadening it to a much bigger focus on supply risk than what we have seen in the past, across all organizations, especially those in the supply chain. But also a broadening of including, corporate social responsibility, sustainability, as well as diversification of our supply base. And so these things, not that they were not a focus. And again, you had variability in terms of how organizations focusing on it before. But what we have seen is a much more broad elevation of these priorities across all organizations. And so that has fundamentally changed. And what that does is fundamentally change our scorecard. The scorecard has to reflect the priorities of the function itself. And it should reflect the priorities of the organization. And that's why I said before is that they shouldn't always be the same. Companies focus on different areas. And so not only is it the selection of the measures, it's also the weighting of those and what's most important. Today, many leaders, with supply chains are telling me that the protection of revenue, basically the mitigation of supply risk, is the most important thing to them. Today, when you can't get supply, nobody really cares about the cost of it. I mean, they care about that, but I need it so I can deliver product, to my customer. And so that's where the focus has been more today than it has been for a lot of organizations than it is on cost savings. Now, do I believe we will go back to once we, some of this current environment of supply constraints, mitigates, sometime hopefully in 2022, potentially later in 2022. Yes, I do believe that will happen. And so I think that's why, scorecards and the way that we look at our performance has to be dynamic. You can't put a scorecard in place, what we were focused on 5 years ago, probably in the scorecard that we put in place, probably doesn't make sense today. And this is why I tell organizations, as you think about your measures that you have to look at that on a more regular basis, at a minimum on an annual basis, to say, do these measures still make sense? And is it driving the kind of behavior in the organization that we really want to have happen? And, if you're going to look at it before that, if a major event occurs, let's say, for example, you go through an acquisition and you're merging with another organization, it's a great time to reflect and say, listen, do the things that we were looking at before still make sense? The pandemic was a great example of something to say, all right, we had a set of priorities, we had a scorecard, we had measures in there that we were looking at. Now, does that still make sense in the current pandemic-infused environment? And the answer is probably not. We saw those priorities shift during this period of time.
Absolutely, Chris. I completely agree with you. And that is what we were talking about, that after pandemic, considering uncertainties has become really important. And business processes and systems, they are inevitably linked sourcing and procurement functions with other enterprise functions as well. So if there is a continuous process improvement in one area, we may experience a ripple effect on others as well. So for example, like if we have improved data and analytics control, it may result in more reliable data for sourcing and procurement decision making. We have better sustainability approach to procurement, we'll be able to like bring a lot of change with the procurement practices, because we are the gate. Like I consider procurement as a gate. Everything is coming in your organization and going out from your organization from the procurement function only. So we could be a change maker, not only for the organization but for the world as well. So for sure, the new age procurement benchmarking is focused not only on examining the efficiency and effectiveness of the sourcing and procurement function, but also on the like the impact of the enterprise on the whole world. So Chris, like I have covered all my questions for the benchmarking, and I would like to summarize it for my audience, that what I would have understand that efficiency and effectiveness are really important. And if I talk about the efficiency, any organization must measure that what are their functional and process costs and staffing levels, what is their overall cost as a percent of spend, what are their transaction costs and productivities, cycle time, cost savings, return on investment, that you really focused on. And whereas when organizations are talking about the effectiveness, it should be based on like the percent of staff that is dedicated to decision support activities, access to information, and how they are leveraging technology, how they are leveraging their suppliers, and the percentage of purchase order transactions that require rework. So these are like my evaluation from our talk right now. And now I'll move ahead and I'll take the questions from the audience. Okay, so the first question is from Manish Papnikar. He's asking, with evolution of technology, are there any new benchmarks that have evolved?
Yeah, it's interesting, as you think about measures of technology. And, one of the things I would argue is that, we're not necessarily seeing an evolution in the output performance measures. I mean, at the end of the day, we're still focused on, how effective are we? Are we reducing risk? Are we able to, reduce cost? Are we able to improve, our, responsibility with organizations? In terms from a corporate standpoint, are we able to drive down the cost and the investments that we make and become more efficient, et cetera? How fast can we go do things? The change which is occurring are really at the next level down, not necessarily output performance measures. So what organizations are, I'll say, more looking at now is the percentage of, for example, percentage of transactions that are digital. So they may look at a particular transactional process, PO processing, for example, and ask themselves, what percentage of these transactions are being done in a more digital way? They may be looking at, some of their sourcing activities and how much of that is being done in a more digital way. Contract management, supplier management, et cetera. Are they being enabled with digital tools? And so, the result of doing this should improve all of these other measures. So the output performance measures aren't really changing, but what we are seeing is more and more focus on the measurement of these other enabling measures. It's sort of creating this cause, it's sort of an activity that has a causation for creating a better performance for the organization. So yes, you're seeing the evolution of more digital measures and looking at the overall set of activities that we are doing, and how digitally enabled are we as an organization across all of these various processes. But the key thing is to understand is it's not just about process automation. It is about decision support. And so there are aspects of, that we will measure to look at, like I mentioned, some of the cycle time measures, the percentage of transactions, that are digital, how much of this activity is being done in a more automated digital kind of way. But also we want to look at decision support. And this is where we see technology and digital tools augmenting what we do as human beings. The thinking work that we do, the intelligence work that we do, the knowledge-based work. And so, what percentage of that activity is being enabled by, tools that potentially are using artificial intelligence, machine learning, that are helping us better sift through massive amounts of data, for example, to make decisions in a more, efficient kind of way, things that we couldn't make decisions on before because it was just too much for us to work with. And now these tools are allowing us to do that. So that's where I see the evolution of the measures is really occurring at that next level down. But what we're doing as an organization in terms of providing performance to the organization really hasn't changed.
Absolutely great. So moving on to the next question. The next question is from Mani. He is asking, I would like to know what are the processes considered when sharing the benchmark of spend managed per FTE by a procurement team, and also the information at the technical level, number of POs per FTE, cost of procurement as a percentage of spend, and also revenue cost per PO.
So if I understand the question correctly, is this person asking for the specific metrics? What is the performance?
No, he's actually talking about the processes. So he's asking about the process that we can consider when we are benchmarking our spend, when we are
Okay.
managing our spend.
Yeah. So the processes of benchmarking spend. So how we might go about doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. When we look at, benchmarking spend, and again, if you're looking at that, and I'm assuming I'm looking at this correctly in terms of what the question was, but if you're looking at spend, there are organizations that do what they call spend benchmarking. So a lot of what I would have been talking about is more process level benchmarking, looking at a particular activity and saying, as I started off, talking about a taxonomy of activity that, comprises what supply management is all about. Because anything that we do, a function within a business is a set of activity or a set of processes. It's a set of activity that we do, and that may change over time. One of the comments, we've augmented, how we define supply management over time. And something that may not have been in our, as a focus or in the remit of a supply management executive 20 years ago is now in that remit. Things like corporate social responsibility. So we've expanded the set of activities that we're doing. And so there's ways to benchmark that, but everything that you benchmark, in supply management is typically, based on the amount of spend that you're actually measuring or managing as an organization. And so organizations will ask, how can I benchmark my spend? And, that's where you start looking at, there's different ways to look at that. So one is I can look at your spend performance and you can look at that from the perspective of, looking at a particular area or a category of spend. Now let's just take a simple area like office supplies. And so if you looked at office supplies and you say, well, how well am I doing there? Well, one way you could ask yourself is my pricing better than what other people's pricing is in office supplies? So when you look at all the various items, you may say, well, am I paying, more or less for a pencil versus everybody else? And again, I'm dumbing this down. So a very simple example, and you may look at that and say, well, when I look at it on a item by item basis, my pricing may be above or below, most other organizations. Now, the challenge in doing that is, when I'm going at that kind of granular kind of level, looking specifically at items and doing price benchmarking, that information is a little bit more difficult to get. There's a lot of considerations that go into creating a like-for-like environment. And I'll give you an example. Organizations will want to come together and say, listen, we want to benchmark something and we want to look at the pricing of it. Let's just take something more simple like a PC, a personal computer. So now I'm going to bring a set of organizations together to benchmark, what they're paying for PCs. Now, the challenge is that, I first have to get a set of organizations that all buy the same type of PC. So whether they're buying Lenovo or HP or some of the other brands that are out there, are they configured the same way? So I have to get to like comparisons, and that's not easy to do across organizations. At the same time, you have other things, is where is it being shipped from? That may not be common between all these organizations as well. So it becomes very challenging to get this like-for-like types of comparisons. Now, there are simpler areas that it is much easier to do like-for-like, comparisons, but in some of these areas, it gets very difficult. So another approach to trying to gain some insight in terms of your spend and benchmarking that is to do what we call spend benchmarking. So it's not necessarily looking at the unit price of what you're actually doing, but actually looking at your total consumption of an area. So let's, for example, go back to office supplies. And when we look at office supplies, you may say, well, our total spend on office supplies is $5 million per year. The question is that a good number or not? I can go out, I can source it, I can drive that cost down. But what I don't know is, is what we're spending on office supplies a correct number? Is that a relevant number and an appropriate number for my industry? And so what you're also considering is not just the price, but the amount, the quantity, the demand of how much of office supplies you're using. And so in this particular case, you may want to have in your denominator the number of people, because you would look at the organization and say, well, everybody is engaging in gaining access to office supplies. So you may divide that 5 million by the total population of your company, the number of employees, and say what our office supply spending is $100 per employee, and then use that to benchmark against other organizations. So your company is spending $100 per employee, and what we see in most other organizations is that they're spending $120. So you would say, we seem to be more efficient in terms of our utilization of office supplies than other organizations. So it brings another dimension in here than others. So that's another approach to looking at spend benchmarking, because there's what looking at, your spend itself. One is to do specific price benchmarking, which can be very complicated to get like-for-like comparisons. The second is to look at it more broadly and look at what we call spend benchmarking.
Absolutely. I think that we have answered the Mani's question, and he would be able to use the two approaches that you have talked about well. So the next question we have is from Edward Murphy. He's asking that how often should you do benchmarking?
Yeah, I look at, almost like anything, it's really going to be gated by the frequency of change. And, we get asked that question quite a bit is, if we're going to go out and do a benchmark, when should we re-benchmark? Well, my comment always is, if you do a benchmark and you don't do anything for the next 3 years, then why benchmark? Because you've done nothing to change the environment. Why are you looking at that? I can tell you right now, most organizations are moving forward. If you haven't done anything, you're going to be more behind than you were when you first benchmarked. So, I think a lot of the frequency I would say the average is probably 3 years, 2 to 3 years, more likely 3 years that organizations will do an organizational benchmark. But, some organizations go through rapid, accelerated transformation. And so they may be doing what most organizations would take 3 years and a year and a half. So in their case, based on the frequency of their change and the velocity of that change, it may be more appropriate for them to take another look after a year and a half, because they went through substantial change, to re-benchmark to say, where are we now in comparison to other organizations? So, to answer your question, and I know everybody loves this answer, it depends, based on that frequency of change and the degree of that change that you're going through.
Exactly, Chris. So the next question is from Abhishek, and he's asking, what is the best way to simplify IT procurement and KPIs to be mindful of?
Yeah, interesting. So specifically IT or information technology, what are some of the measures you could look at there? Yeah, I would suggest that, we start to, you can use similar types of measures for all different types of areas. So if we're looking at organizational measures, I would look at IT procurement and that whole particular area, similar to the measures that I would look at for the overall organization. There are some that probably wouldn't be relevant, but I would be looking at, what kind of return are you producing for the organization, in terms of spend savings and cost avoidances and other operating, benefits that you're creating. I would look at, what am I investing in that particular area? And what kind of ROI am I getting in that IT category, based on the investments and the return that I'm getting. Now, how I define a return can be broad. I mean, spend savings or cost reductions is one way to, look at a return, but there are other ways as well. And when I'm looking at IT, certainly one of the areas that you focus on is information security and data privacy and things like that, depending on, the IT providers that we're leveraging. And so those will be things that I may more heavily weight in terms of, how I look at the performance of that area. So risk becomes, something that I need to have a higher consideration. I'll just give maybe, just a perspective that we've had organizations look at all of their various areas of categories. And you could do this by category, you could do this by event, but start to look at, the performance on a more granular kind of level.
Yeah.
So you can look at the ROI of your overall organization and to say, if we're going to look at ROI in a more simplistic way, looking at the return, and let's just say we're going to use it in a more simplistic way and look at spend cost reduction plus cost avoidances divided by my overall investments in procurement, my organizational cost, which would include your labor, outsourcing, technology, and other investments. What is that? Now, you may have a number that you look at for the overall organization, the overall procurement supply management organization. But what you're going to see at the next level down by category is variation and variability. And so you may have some areas where you're getting a 10x return. You may have other areas that you're getting a 5x return. You got other areas of 2x or 1x, maybe even below 1. And so as you look at that, it can help guide you in terms of the allocation of your resources. Where are we getting the best return for the investments that we're making? And, is there a way that I can allocate my resources in a more architected way and a more prioritized way that I can increase my return to the overall organization? And so I think that's a good exercise to go through to really look at it on a much more granular basis to use that, because most of us can't cover off on all of the activity that is occurring. We're all constrained in our resources. So we have to make resource allocation decisions. And so when we make those, we need to be informed in terms of how we make those. And a good way to inform is, what do we believe the possibility or the kind of returns I can get, the opportunity, and then direct my resources there. Now, I know there's other things of consideration, level of risk, et cetera, because there are going to be things that, maybe it's not a big return from a financial standpoint, but it is, from a risk mitigation standpoint. So those things have to be, considered and factored in as well.
Absolutely, yes. And risk mitigation is becoming more important part as compared to when we are talking about cost reductions and cost savings. So moving on to our next question. The next question is your opinion on actual savings versus negotiated savings. What is the typical industry gap?
Yeah, great question, because it's one of those things is that I have negotiated savings that I have secured through some kind of process, typically a sourcing or strategic sourcing process that I've gone through, and at the end of that process, I have secured, at least in on paper, the potential to drive savings to our organization. And then after that, whether or not those savings are realized really depends on the compliance to using that particular supplier, the processes to ensure that we're actually paying what we agreed to. There's a number of things that could help, not help, but, mitigate, that total potential of savings. And so the question is that, where I get this question a lot is, what do we account for in procurement? Do we account our value based on negotiated savings, or do we do it based on realized savings? Now, everybody has their opinion here, and many of the organizations I go to, the financial executives will say, I want it on realized savings. I wanted to see it on the bottom line. And I take a little bit different perspective here. What I look at is supply management organization creates an opportunity for the business. It creates an opportunity to take advantage of savings that has occurred in the organization. And whether or not those savings are taking advantage of and are taking out of, I'll say the budgets of organizations, is a decision that really the business has to make. That's not a procurement decision. Procurement, as it goes through it, you look at the difference between negotiated savings and realized savings. One of the biggest things is, how do we measure procurement? But that gap in terms of what procurement should be measured on, in my opinion, is more than negotiated savings. And it can help in the enablement of actually helping to realize those savings. But if the business decides that it believes that that money that was freed up as a result of the good work that procurement did is better used by spending that and making it an investment versus, taking that to the bottom line, that's a business decision. And I would assume that that's the right decision. That's not a procurement decision. And so this is where you get these challenges around realized savings. And so to me, once you've created that opportunity, the business has to decide on what it's going to do with that opportunity, with that savings that was created, and whether it's going to be realized or whether it's going to be actually invested. And procurement should not be, marginalized, based on that type of decision.
Absolutely, Chris. So now moving on to the next question. The next question is, what are the top 3 or 5 key metrics for a CPO?
Top three to five. Again, a great question, something that you and I have been talking about a bit. And again, I look at those top 3 to 5. I say there's the measures that a CPO should have, and you make that decision based on, what is the business trying to accomplish? And working in a business where risk is one of the most important things, and the protection of revenue right now is one of the key areas, then I would expect that my scorecard should reflect that business priority as a procurement executive, as a CPO. If corporate social responsibility and what we're doing to create a different kind of environment to create more diversity, to create more equity, within our supply chain, to create more environmental, better environmental, situation within the supply chain, are key priorities for the company, then that ought to be a top measure for me, as a CPO. So that's one side of it. It has to be aligned to what the organization wants out of my organization to enable the business success. But then the other side of it is, what are the most common measures that a CPO gets measured on? And you can look at it that way. So commonality, I mean, certainly the spend savings, as I mentioned before, risk today is becoming, but the challenge with risk is it's difficult to quantify.
Yeah.
So we see many organizations not, how do I measure the output of risk? What is the output performance? In many ways, I always liken it to buying insurance. You can buy insurance, but I could sit there and say, I have car insurance. Last year, I never had an accident. So was that a good investment? I never used it. And the answer is yes. Well, risk is the same way. It's an insurance. So if you go through the year and nothing happens, you haven't had a chance to prove yourself, but you've mitigated, potential, it's hard to predict what risks would have happened, because you've already mitigated them. So it's very difficult to quantify. So some organizations have gone as far as creating what they call risk indexes. So they'll look at their totality of their supply base and they'll look at it and assign a level of risk to different suppliers, high, medium, low, for example. And then they'll look at that and say, well, that supplier, how much revenue are they attached to? And so organizations will look at metrics like revenue at risk, even margin at risk, as indicators of how well they're doing. And so it's saying, all right, I'm doing things that mitigate that risk within my supply chain, whatever that might be. I may be looking at dual sources where I have a single source, a lot of different techniques that you can use to do that. And as a result of that, I've been driving down the level of risk. And that doesn't guarantee a risk event won't occur, but it certainly takes, potentially a lot of more common things that could occur, and mitigates it to a level. So that's one way people are doing it. So risk has certainly been elevated as a more common measure today. Certainly the investment is one of those. Cycle times, experience is certainly one of those. So, more and more, leaders of procurement, CPOs, are looking at the experience that they're creating, the value in engaging. And again, it's not just about the internal stakeholder. It's creating an experience for those suppliers, those partners that you have, who are especially important in this very constrained environment that we have today.
Absolutely, Chris. So we are left with very less time. So moving on to next question. The next question is by Talib. He is asking, please share your insights in terms of supplier relationship management. How do we benchmark as per industry standards and key metrics to understand we are progressing towards achieving them?
Yeah, I think this question is an interesting one because your first question always is, how do you define supplier relationship management? And the way that, I define that and how we define it at Hackett is that all of the activities that occur after you have architected your supply base. So we have sourcing activities that we tend to do as organizations to architect the most optimal supply base to meet our needs as a company. But after that, we may have a 1, 2, 3+ year contract or agreement with that suppliers that we've contracted with. So the question is, how do we manage that over time? And there's different aspects to management. One is you want to consider their performance. Are these suppliers meeting the performance expectations that we set for them, and hopefully improving those over time? Another dimension is risk. Now, risk we have to consider as part of the sourcing process and the onboarding process with a supplier, but we need to manage risk over time, as I was mentioning. Where do we have risk with certain suppliers? Are we mitigating that risk? And managing over time. So we want to bring some visibility to, managing that risk within which would be part of supplier relationship management as well. And then the third aspect is just, there's value that sits out in that supply base that we've identified that we're just not really taking advantage of. And this is where terms like supplier innovation come into the mix. We have an agreement with a supplier. There's certain things that we're expecting from them, and they're providing that to us. But what other capabilities do they have? Can we create an environment to allow us to enable that kind of value coming back to us? And so we want to look at ways to measure that. And so some of the ways, we talked a little bit about the risk, but when we look at performance, we can, there are measures that you can look at is, are the suppliers meeting the performance expectations that you set? Many organizations have frameworks that they use from all of their suppliers in terms of, these are the things that we really care about in terms of supplier performance. And the one thing I would say is that supplier performance ought to be aligned to your procurement, supply management performance, which is then aligned to the overall objectives. So it's not aligning just procurement to the objectives of the company. It's aligning the supplier to procurement to the company. When all of that is aligned, you're truly enabling the business. And then from an innovation standpoint, organizations are measuring things like cycle time and product development processes. They're measuring cost reductions. They're measuring revenue enhancements. They're looking at market share and just time to market types of measures, et cetera. So are we enabling that product development process, for example, in innovation, by involving our suppliers in that particular process? So again, some just some quick insights in terms of how you might start to think about measuring across the totality of supplier relationship management.
Absolutely. So there is another question by an audience. So it would be a follow-up question for this question only. So he's asking, please tell us about 3 minimum strategies to rid supplier risk.
Strategies to reduce risk. So, I'll talk about, one in particular. I mean, when we came out of the pandemic, supply risk was significantly exposed during that environment. And one of the things that was exposed was the lack of geographical diversity within our supply chains themselves. When we saw the world start to lock down because of the pandemic in specific countries, say China, for example, it constrained supply. And if you have, a significant portion of your supply, and this is what we saw in a number of different organizations, coming out of China, well, you're now, interrupting your ability to create revenue because you can't get access to supply. And so we saw this not just in China, but other countries as well, where, we had, in the way we designed our supply chains, without thinking about an event that could, take over the entire world, that we designed, in some cases with very little, what I'll call geographical diversity. What we're seeing today to mitigate that going forward is, we're seeing a diversification occur. And so that's been happening since last year, where organizations may not be exiting China, but they're diversifying. And that's just one country. It may be Europe, it may be Mexico, et cetera. But they're saying, you know what, I'm going to go and put 50% here, 50% here. Now, that may increase costs, but it does provide some more assurance of supply, when we go through different situations. So, I think, what we have seen is that organizations, will look at, the design of supply chains through the lens of cost in a more heavily weighted, variable. What we're seeing today is that, we're seeing the rise of, and have seen, I mean, really since last year and even before, it's a rise of looking at the level of agility we have in those supply chains, the resilience, as well as, just the speed by which we actually, are able to go do things. So we're seeing sort of a redesign around that. So that's one of the ways is, specifically coming out of that, supply chain environment. I think another thing that the pandemic exposed, which goes to another way of mitigating risk, is the lack of visibility that a lot of companies had into the multiple tiers of the supply chain. So when we were having disruptions in the supply chain, we could see what was happening with our tier 1, but we didn't necessarily have the visibility to tier 2 and tier 3 and beyond even. And as a result of that, you're seeing organizations using technology to gain better visibility into the multiple tiers of their supply chain. So they're not necessarily as reactive as they were before, but more proactive when they see things happening, further deeper down or up in that supply chain, that they're able to react in a more proactive way, and respond more quickly to help to try to mitigate before it actually happens. So there's a number of things that organizations are doing to mitigate risk. I mean, there's a whole host. I always tell organizations, the first thing you need to understand is, what are you trying to protect first? Are you trying to protect your revenue, your margins, your brand as a company, your people from a safety standpoint, your intellectual property? There's a whole host of things you're trying to protect as a company. And then the business has to prioritize those for you. And then as a result, you have to look at the supply chain and say, if brand is the most important thing to us as an organization, what can we do in the supply chain to mitigate any impact to our brand? Well, if you were to find out in your supply chain that in the third tier you were using forced labor, that would have a big impact on your brand in the global market as a company. So those are some things that you'd want to go do, but the business has to prioritize those for you.
Absolutely, Chris. And after the pandemic, we are adapting digital technologies as well.
Prana, I cannot hear you. Well, I think Prana, I don't know if everybody's still on right now, but I think she's actually going to be coming back here shortly. So we'll wait for a second. Looks like she may have had some connection issues, and we'll be joining shortly.
Hey, Chris, I have lost you. Maybe there were some network issues, but we are back. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. I think I lost you on my side. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm seeing that. It looks like I believe, I guess the question is, can you hear me, or is it more of an issue with Perena?
Chris, can you hear me now?
I can, but I keep on losing you.
Yeah, there are some network issues, I believe. So we'll take the last question for the session today. So the question is by Robert, and he's asking, with price being confidential, how do people benchmark what other people are paying?
Yeah, I mean, if price is confidential, and typically, if you're going to do that, there are laws to sharing price, especially in certain industries, that they can't be discussed. And typically, two of the things that you can't discuss with other organizations: who are the suppliers? Not only the suppliers, but what is their performance, as well as what is the pricing that you're getting from certain suppliers. So we have antitrust laws against that. So how organizations tend to get around that is using third parties to do the benchmark, right? And so that information is protected, and and again, it's done through a third party, and a third party will provide that information back and protect the confidentiality of any individual pricing. So that's how organizations get around that.
Absolutely, Chris. So though we are running out of time, if time allows you, can we take 2 or 3 more questions on digital procurement?
Are you asking me if I have more time?
Yes.
I can, let's see, it's 10 after. Let's go for a couple more minutes. I'll take a few more questions, and then we can wrap up.
Sure. So we'll just take 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll wrap up. So we have already talked about procurement benchmarking, and we have understood that benchmarking could improve insights and strategies that lead to accelerated cost leadership. But Chris, if I'll go back to digital procurement, I can see an analogy there that digital procurement solutions is allowing us for many more physical and digital inputs to be connected. It is for driving better decision making and improving efficiency as well, and ultimately it is producing results that we are trying to achieve with procurement benchmarking. So clearly digital procurement is enabler for me, and it is top of mind concern for many procurement professionals as well. So what is your assessment of the state of digital maturity of procurement, and what metrics do you use to assess it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state of digital maturity is we're further ahead than where we were, and we continue to move forward. I think the most important thing that occurred, and I've highlighted the pandemic several times, but one of the things that may be surprising to individuals, and is that the pandemic, the effect that it had on the digital transformation that organizations were going through, was it had an accelerating effect. And a lot of that was due to the fact that it, really exposed a lot of vulnerabilities within organizations around their digital maturity. And they were seeing that organizations that had progressed further along were able to respond more quickly. And so this was in many ways, the business case that a lot of companies had and needed to move forward and accelerate their efforts around digital transformation. So as you look at that, I think, we were going on at a pace, but the progression of the maturity from a digital standpoint of organizations over the last year and a half has been much accelerated and significant to where we were before. But I think, as you think about digital, I always tell organizations, digital transformation is not just about the technology. There are other enablers that, are needed to allow this to be successful. And one of those is the people, the talent. If you're going to create a more digital environment, you're going to have people that can engage in that environment. And what you find is that in more digital environments, skills such as the engagement with data become more important. Analytical skills become more important. Having more comfort around technology becomes more important. And so we have to work with our talent to bring them up in terms of as we're continuing to progress our overall environment to be more digital. We have to also progress our talent to be able to engage in that environment. At the same time, technology and digital technology needs data to be successful. And so there's work that needs to be done ensuring that the data that is being consumed by these systems and even being created ultimately on the output is valid, it's accurate, and it's expanding over time. And so this becomes very important to enabling that particular environment.
Absolutely, Chris. I totally agree. The three factors you have mentioned, like the art procurement teams, the data, and the technology, they all can be a disruption for the procurement. And we are seeing that, technology is enabling strategic sourcing, and strategic sourcing is becoming more predictive. And transactional procurement is becoming more automated. And if I talk about supplier risk management, so we are becoming more proactive with the help of technology and with the help of data. And some of the digital solutions and capabilities, they have actually entered their maturing phase, if I see. And the CPOs that have not already embraced them for the competitive advantage, they should expect them to become, table stakes quickly. But Chris, could you please put more light on how the digital procurement methodologies have changed over the period of time?
I think, if you look at the digital, you said methodologies, correct?
Yeah.
In terms of how they have changed.
Yeah.
I guess as you look at that, as I was saying before, I don't think transformation in and of itself has fundamentally changed. Transformation is really the same. The methodology by which we go through transforming organizations is the same. But what we have done is with digital is to really step back and in some cases think about a digital first kind of environment. If we were to do this all over and we created it in a more digital way, what would it look like? And so some of the I'll say the things that come along with this idea of digital transformation from a methodology standpoint have changed, because what you see in digital today is much more focused on the customer. And so we use, this idea of customer centricity, that we have to design, it's not just about the technology, but are we designing in a way through the eyes of the stakeholder? And again, in our case, in supply management, that stakeholder could be the supplier, it could be an internal stakeholder, it could be the external customer, it could be partners as well. So how are we designing this capability through that lens? Not necessarily through the lens of the procurement organization. So that becomes a key tenet in terms of this methodology. I think the other thing is the speed by which we actually transform. Organizations are losing patience, and I mean they want to move fast. They see the world the way we are today. It's disruptive, and you have disruptive companies out there, and so we have to move at a different clock speed. So we're changing our methodologies in terms of the way that we think. People are using terms like fail fast, and they've been talking about this for a number of years now. But trying to get that culture to not to be afraid of failing, to try to move forward very quickly. And so those are some of I'll say the methodological types of changes or mindsets that have changed, with digital transformation than what we have seen before.
For sure, Chris. And I'm thoroughly enjoying this discussion, and I hope so our audience is. So we have absolutely lived the 2 decades of procurement space, and with your thought-provoking inputs, we have seen actually that how far digital procurement and procurement benchmarking have come in 2 decades, and where it is headed to. So how digital procurement is becoming table stakes, and how organizations are adopting some critical procurement imperatives as well. So Chris, now moving on to our last question for today. So I will list a few critical functional imperatives in vogue for procurement, and I want to understand that what is your take on the level of adoption of these and why. So the first one is procurement boards.
Yeah, I would say if I was to look at something like that, the level of adoption, I would say it's at more of a medium kind of level. We
Mm-hmm.
are certainly seeing, the bots within organizations, and some people use the term, RPA, robotic process automation, which
Yeah.
creates those bots. And so we have seen that. I'm not saying that it's, fully deployed across all organizations, but when you just look at bots and RPA in terms of the way it was, has evolved, it was really around automating processes, but not necessarily in an intelligent way. It sort of took the activity we're doing today and then put it into a machine to go do that activity. And so it has reduced what I would say some of the more transactional, repetitive kind of work that we do as an organization. So I would say we're about a medium level of deployment of that technology as I look across most organizations today. It's not uncommon, but it's not super common either.
Yeah. So the next one is autonomous procurement.
Autonomous procurement.
Yeah.
In that area, I would say we're at a low level deployment. This is an
Okay.
emerging area. I think it's an exciting area.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, where we start looking at the intelligence. We were just talking about bots, which is more of a non-intelligent type of technology. But you're seeing people advance bots to say, all right, we're going to have we have sort of RPA, robotic process automation, and sort of moving that and transitioning that into intelligent automation. And this is where you start embedding, the tools that we've described, the artificial intelligence that learn. So these become more learning systems that, as activities are done, they learn from what they did before and, start to make decisions. And so this is where we start seeing not necessarily the augmentation or the replacement of the more process automation kind of work that we're doing as organizations. But
Yeah.
really, these are the types of areas that we're moving into where we augment the human beings, we as sourcing professionals, category management professionals, procurement professionals, augmenting what we go do. There are things today in terms of, dealing with massive amounts of data that has always been very difficult for us to do, doing and creating predictive models around risk that, automation becomes, in this kind of way, the augmented, artificial intelligence types of tools become very valuable for us to help us do some of that and also learn from itself. And so it augments what we do as a, cognitive being.
Absolutely. And even with the outsourcing, we have seen a lot of freelancers in the procurement environment. So the next one is the use of freelancers for procurement.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess it's the definition of freelancers. Have we seen that? I mean, I think you can go and talk about the whole gig economy and, is that happening? I've had people, in my practice, over the years that have left, said, hey, I don't want to work for a firm. I want to go take my chances in the gig economy and I'll just go work for a bunch of different companies and, and to your point, be a freelancer. Yeah, I would still say it's more of a lower level of adoption today. I mean, it's certainly out there. Organizations are considering it, but I don't see it being dominant in terms of, what organizations are doing. And at least that's the view that I have. We certainly see a lot of contractors out there, but I think that's different than the freelancers. I still see this is, sort of still a low level of utilization today.
Okay. Yeah, but we can still expect a lot of crowdsourcing and freelancing in procurement space in the coming years.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we'll see. It'll be interesting. I think you are going to see operating models change,
Yeah.
and I think organizations will decide on what am I going to use my talent for, and how much will I use third parties for. Whether it be an outsourcing, whether it be freelancers, et cetera, and how do I architect that organization? I always go back to what I said before. At the end of the day, we're here to enable the business. And if I can enable that more effectively by using a portfolio of freelancers, then I'll go about doing it.
Absolutely. So, Chris, with this, we come to an end of this LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much for joining the show today. And I
Yeah,
hope our audience
absolutely.
have enjoyed it. And it
Yeah,
was
well, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, it was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. And there was a lot that I learned from you today. And similarly, our audience have as well. And some of the advice you provided today, it'll stick by our side from for the coming decades, I would say. And I hope you'll have a fantastic week ahead. Thank you to everyone who have joined us today. And I hope to see you all again soon in our upcoming LinkedIn Lives. Stay tuned with Procurement League. Thank you.
All righty. Bye bye.
Bye bye.